Have you ever been watching a film where the hero or heroine is in some form of danger? Have you noticed how tense you feel? Your heart starts to race. You may even begin to hold your breath. All this is because you're feeling empathy. But what exactly is empathy? And how is it even possible to feel what someone else is experiencing?
Empathy is the ability to share feelings with others. So you are like resonating with the feeling another has, and it can be pain, so you share the pain of another if someone is suffering, but it can also be joy. You also have empathic joy, so there you share the joy of someone else, right?
So when we think about empathy and what happens in our brain, it's probably firstly important to say that empathy is not really in one place in our brain. Different brain regions are involved to a greater or lesser degree, depending on whether we are sharing the person's experience, whether we're thinking about their experience, or maybe, the wider related behaviours about deciding whether to help or how to engage. Now, brain imaging studies have shown that, we use similar parts of our brain, both for when we experience a certain state, but also when we see somebody else experiencing that type of state. So let's say we see somebody in pain, we tend to, recruit similar parts of our brain as when we actually experience pain ourselves. Now, we call this vicarious brain activity.
Most people think of empathy as a force for good. After all, it can motivate us to help and care for others. But are there any downsides to feeling someone else's pain?
There's also a strong tendency in empathy to favor one's own group. There's a lot of in-group, out-group bias connected with empathy on many levels. This can be an immediate friend of a group of friends, where people just react much more strongly to the emotions of group members in comparison to people that are from another group. And we also know that this scales up. This scales up to groups that have a different ethnicity as ours.
People in power often play to this idea of us v them. And it's not difficult to think of examples in history where focusing empathy levels on one group has led to extreme violence towards others. For example, colonialism, war, genocide, terrorism, or religious persecution.
Side-taking is one of these points where empathy misfires. And it's not that empathy fails. No, empathy gets into it, but it stays one-sided and gives people reasons to justify why their one side is the right one. And people therefore feel justified in lashing back at the other side. And that is a big problem, of course.
This idea can underpin certain social media campaigns to cancel people, and can even fuel hatred and violence towards the other side.
So empathy in many cases of conflicts in the world can be more a problem than part of the solution.
Empathy in itself is a very healthy response. So we are literally sharing this emotion with another in terms of activating similar network in our brain, which are also processing this emotion in ourselves. It's like a mirroring mechanism. So that's empathy in the brain. Now, how that can backfire is if empathy is moving or turning into what we call personal distress or empathic distress. But when this self-other distinction blurs, if you are not aware anymore that this is not your emotion, but the emotion of the other, it becomes your own, and it can move into what we call empathic distress or personal distress. And it's only when you get into this personal distress that it can become, in that sense, dangerous if you have it a lot. So in care professions or in healthcare profession, if you're confronted with suffering every day, strong suffering, and if you have not learned how to regulate empathy so that it doesn't go into this empathic distress, it can backfire.
In some extreme cases, this empathy fatigue can be incapacitating and can become a barrier to action.
Empathy is also a social glue, is also putting us as social human being together. But when it goes into empathic distress, it is in danger of us burning out or feeling too much distress, too much stress. On the long run, it can feel, turn to burnout.
Some people might, just become potentially desensitized. They might just want to step away from everything.
So where does that leave us? Should we actively discourage empathy?
we can transform this healthy empathic response in compassion. And compassion is a totally different response to suffering. It is more like a feeling of warmth and love and concern, and it is rooted in a system we call care system, a biological affiliation and care system. So it comes with a protective nature. So you can say you'd never burn out of too much love, right? If you love someone and you care for someone, you can't burn out. It's a positive, resilient feeling. And so you can learn how to move from this natural first empathic response of sharing the suffering of the other into compassion, where you have more this concern and especially a strong motivation to want to benefit the other. The welfare of the other person is in your focus. It's not about you. The empathic distress response is all about me. How can I get out? How can I feel better? How can I save myself? And so you might even be nasty to the other, like keep away with your stress, keep away with your suffering, right? That is a response which comes out of this distress. But in compassion, you are like all about the other, right? It's how can I help you? How can I benefit you? What can I do so that you are happy again, that you don't suffer anymore, right?
But is it possible to foster greater compassion in people?
If you're confronted with suffering, you have this pain matrix lighting up. But when you go in compassion, you have totally different networks in the brain lighting up, which are the networks of affiliation, care, and love. And what we showed in the mental training studies is that you can specifically use certain mental training practices to foster this care and affiliative compassion network. And you can strengthen it, you can increase compassion and even the hardware of your brain, like structural brain plasticity. And so you can actually help healthcare providers and people who have to work a lot with the suffering of others every day to actually build up their resilience and become more healthy.